It was a typical Saturday afternoon at Riverview Mall. The food court bustled with activity, shoppers moved between stores, and the checkout lines in the grocery store were packed. Among them stood Malcolm Hayes, a 25-year-old black man, waiting patiently to pay for his groceries. He wore a navy shirt with the logo of the local fire department and stood with a calm demeanor, his hands resting on the counter. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. By the way, what city are you watching us from? Write it in the comments, we're curious. Behind him, an elderly woman, Margaret Sanderson, was growing increasingly frustrated. The line wasn't moving fast enough for her, and she muttered under her breath as she shifted from foot to foot. But when Malcolm placed his items on the conveyor belt and started to pay, something inside her snapped. "Go back to Africa," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise of the store. "You don't belong here. This is my America, not yours." The other customers in line stopped what they were doing, some shocked, others nodding in agreement. Margaret's words hit Malcolm like a slap, but he didn't flinch. His back remained straight, and his expression stayed calm. Margaret's words got louder, and a few other people behind her started murmuring support, giving her the courage to keep yelling. "You think you can just take over," she spat. "You're nothing but a burden." Malcolm stood still, his eyes fixed forward. He didn't say anything at first. He could feel the stares of everyone in the store on him, but he didn't let it break his composure. The cashier, a young Latina woman, looked nervous, unsure of what to do. She glanced between Malcolm and Margaret, not wanting to make things worse. Margaret's face reddened as she crossed her arms. "You're taking up everyone's time," she added, barely containing her anger. Malcolm, despite the torrent of insults, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he quietly finished paying for his groceries, collected his bag, and calmly turned to face her. The crowd fell silent. With steady eyes, he looked at Margaret, who now seemed to realize her words had gone too far. "You don't know me," he said softly. His voice was measured, firm, but not angry. As Malcolm stood there, the tension in the air was palpable. The whispers behind him grew louder, and more people in line were starting to take sides. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, others nodded in quiet agreement with Margaret's outburst. The older woman stood with a look of self-righteous anger, her arms still crossed tightly across her chest. But Malcolm refused to let the situation escalate further. His posture remained calm, and his eyes stayed focused. He took a slow breath and then, without raising his voice, began to speak. "You want to talk about America?" Malcolm began. "Well, let me tell you about my America." Margaret blinked, caught off guard by his composed response. For a moment, it seemed like she didn't know how to react. The other people in the line, now sensing a shift, started to quiet down, the mood growing heavier with each passing second. Malcolm continued, his words deliberate. "My grandfather fought in World War II. My grandmother fought for civil rights. They fought for freedom in this country, your country, too." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people exchanged uncertain looks. They hadn't expected Malcolm to speak. They hadn't expected him to be articulate or calm, especially after the anger Margaret had shown. Malcolm went on, his tone unwavering. "Both of them were veterans, and they didn't fight so people like you could tell me to go back to Africa. They fought so people like me, people like you, could live free, regardless of our skin color." He paused, letting the words sink in. Margaret's face turned a shade of red deeper than before, but Malcolm wasn't finished. "My parents," he continued, "they're doctors. They work tirelessly every day to save lives, both black and white. They treat everyone, no matter their race, with the same care and respect." Malcolm's eyes flicked around the room, catching the eyes of the onlookers. The crowd was finally listening, their earlier mockery replaced by cautious attention. "And me," he said, his voice steady, "I'm a firefighter. Every day, I run into burning buildings to save people. I don't care if they're black, white, Asian, or anything else. I just care about saving their lives. Because that's what America is about: respect, humanity, and service. For a moment, there was silence. No one in the store knew exactly what to say, and it was clear that Malcolm's calm, collected words had made an impact. Even Margaret seemed taken aback. Malcolm locked eyes with her, his face now softer but just as firm. I don't deserve your hatred. I deserve your respect, just like anyone else. I've earned it. The older woman didn't speak at first, but the words had already started to sink in. Margaret looked down, her expression unreadable. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, some people even beginning to look away. Malcolm didn't wait for an apology. Instead, he turned back to the cashier, nodding to her as he picked up his groceries. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His actions, his words, his life, everything he had just shared, spoke louder than any insult ever could. As he walked toward the exit, the atmosphere in the store was completely different. The air felt thick, but now there was no shouting, no anger, just the sound of shifting feet and people trying to process what had just unfolded. As Malcolm exited the store, the heated confrontation seemed to follow him. The moment he stepped outside, the weight of the crowd's judgment seemed to evaporate, but a sense of quiet anger lingered in his chest. His thoughts weren't on Margaret, though, or the few who had supported her. They were on the countless faces he had seen throughout his life, the people he had saved, the lives he had touched. Malcolm's story wasn't just about defying the ignorance of a stranger, it was about a lineage of service that had been passed down to him, one that had shaped him into the person he was today. He thought of his grandfather, a man who had marched in the streets during the civil rights movement. His grandfather had seen the worst of America, the violence, the hatred, and yet, he had fought with unwavering belief that things could change. He had fought in Europe during World War II, but his real battle had always been back home, for equality. His grandmother, a fierce woman with a voice that carried weight, had been on the front lines of every protest. She had raised her children in the same spirit of defiance and hope, showing them that real strength wasn't in submission but in the fight for justice. Then there were his parents. They didn't just work to heal people's bodies, they worked to heal society's divides. His mother, a doctor, had treated everyone who walked through her doors, no matter their race or background. His father, just as dedicated, had saved countless lives, often working around the clock in the city's busiest hospital. It was the example they set that had led Malcolm down his own path of service. He had followed in their footsteps, choosing to become a firefighter not for the glory, but for the chance to make a real difference in the world. He had seen fire after fire, each time rushing into danger without hesitation, pulling people, strangers, out of the flames. The color of their skin didn't matter. All that mattered was that he was there when they needed him. Yet, here he was, being questioned by a woman who didn't understand the very thing that made America great, the ability to serve others, regardless of where you came from or what you looked like. But Malcolm didn't let that hatred define him. He'd been taught to rise above it, to show strength through service. His legacy wasn't one of bitterness, it was a legacy of perseverance, of fighting not with fists, but with actions. And every time he saved a life, every time he helped someone, he proved that there was no room for hate in his heart. As Malcolm drove home that day, the calmness of his thoughts contrasted sharply with the tension of the store. But he knew, deep down, that the conversation with Margaret wasn't over. It wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who needed to hear his story, to understand the history that shaped him. The legacy of service wasn't something he could abandon. It was his birthright. And whether it was on the front lines of a war or in a burning building, Malcolm was determined to carry it with him. Because no matter how much hate some might throw his way, his service would always be louder, more powerful. Malcolm sat in his car, the engine still running, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The events of the day had hit him harder than he'd expected. Margaret's words still echoed in his mind, "Go back to your Africa." He had saved lives. He had sacrificed his own safety for others countless times. But now, it seemed that wasn't enough. He wasn't just a firefighter. He wasn't just a son of two hardworking, respected professionals. To some, he would always be just a black man, someone who didn't belong in their vision of America. But Malcolm wasn't about to let her view of him become his reality. He couldn't afford to. He had work to do, lives to save. With a deep breath, Malcolm shut off the engine and stepped out of the car. He walked into his apartment complex, greeted by familiar faces, his neighbors, the elderly couple who lived next door, the young single mother with 2 kids. They all knew him. They all saw him for who he was, just a man trying to do good. But for some, that wasn't enough. In the days that followed, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling of being under a microscope. He kept doing his job, responding to calls, rushing into burning buildings, saving people, no questions asked. But a seed of doubt was planted. Every time he pulled someone from a fire, or carried an elderly woman out of a collapsing house, he wondered if those lives truly mattered to everyone. Was he still just a hero in the eyes of those he saved? Or would he always be seen as less than to others? Despite the nagging doubt, Malcolm knew his work wasn't finished. In the firehouse, he worked side by side with other firefighters, some white, some black, some Latino. They didn't care about his skin color. When the alarm went off, they rushed to work together, focused on saving lives. That was the truth he clung to. But there was something more personal now. The sacrifice wasn't just about putting out fires or rushing into dangerous situations, it was the emotional toll. Each call, each life saved, felt heavier than before. Malcolm knew that he could keep giving, keep serving, but he also knew there would always be those like Margaret who would never understand. One evening, after a long shift, Malcolm sat alone on the roof of the firehouse. The city sprawled before him, lights flickering in the distance. It was peaceful here, but his mind kept going back to the day at the store. To the insults. To the faces that watched but said nothing. He realized the true sacrifice wasn't in the fires he fought, but in the constant emotional battle he faced outside of them. He had to be stronger. Not just for the people he saved, but for himself. Every day, Malcolm chose to sacrifice the comfort of being accepted, to stand firm in his identity. He wasn't going to let hate shape him. He wasn't going to let the bigotry of one woman define his worth. He was a firefighter, a son, a man with a legacy. And with every life he saved, every person he pulled from a burning building, he proved that his service, his sacrifice, was the real measure of his value. The weeks following the incident at the store passed in a blur. Malcolm had tried to put it behind him, focusing on his work as a firefighter. But the weight of that day lingered, hanging over him like a shadow. He couldn't shake the memory of the woman's words, and every time he fought a fire, he wondered if people really saw him for who he was, or if they only saw the color of his skin. One afternoon, as he was leaving the station, Malcolm received a call, an apartment fire in a high-rise building. He and his crew rushed to the scene. As they approached the building, smoke billowed from the windows, and sirens wailed in the background. Another emergency, another life on the line. Malcolm didn't hesitate. He led his team into the building, his training kicking in. His focus was razor-sharp. As he climbed the stairs, carrying equipment, a young woman from the building's lobby approached him. She looked frantic, her eyes wide with fear. "Please," she said, gasping for breath, "there's a child trapped on the top floor. Please, you have to save her." Malcolm nodded and didn't waste a second. He and his partner raced up the stairs, hearing the crackling of flames grow louder with each step. As they reached the top floor, the heat was almost unbearable. The hallway was engulfed in smoke, and the sound of the fire was deafening. But there was no time to hesitate. The child was in there, somewhere. They pushed forward, following the sound of the child's cries. Finally, they found her, clutching a stuffed animal, her face streaked with tears. Malcolm scooped her up, covering her with his jacket, and started to head back toward the exit. But just as they turned to leave, a loud crack echoed through the building. The ceiling above them began to collapse. There was no time to think. Malcolm's instincts kicked in, and he pushed his partner and the child ahead of him, shielding them as debris rained down. The impact knocked him to the floor, and the pain was instant. His body screamed, but his mind was focused only on getting the child out of the building. With what little strength he had left, he managed to get them both to safety. The firefighters outside rushed to help, pulling them away from the flames just as the building collapsed further behind them. The child was safe. But Malcolm. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, stitches, and broken bones. Malcolm had saved the child, but at a cost. He lay in his hospital bed, the weight of what he'd endured sinking in. But something inside him was different now. It wasn't just the physical toll of his job, it was the realization that the fight for respect, for dignity, would always be ongoing. There would always be those who tried to tear him down, but as long as he kept saving lives, he had purpose. Malcolm closed his eyes, feeling the sharp ache in his chest. But despite everything, he knew one thing for certain: the real fight wasn't about race or hate. It was about showing the world that people like him, people who served, who gave, who sacrificed, were worthy of respect, no matter the color of their skin.